Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi shir.
Shalom and welcome to today's Daf Yomi Brachos Daf Beis. Says the Mishnah, Me'emasai koyre neshma ba'aravin. From what time may one be koyre krishma ba'aravin in the evenings? What is the beginning of the time to recite krishma every evening? Because the Torah, when the Torah describes the krishma shel arvis, the Torah says b'shachvacha. When you lie down, it's a general term. We're not sure exactly at what point in time it's considered to be b'shachvacha. Says the Mishnah, what is the time of b'shachvacha? Misha, from the point in time, sha'kahanim nechnasim, that the kahanim enter, they come back home, lechal b'trumasan, to eat their truma. We're speaking about kahanim who were tamei, and were required to be toivel in a mikveh, and to have hair of shemesh, to immerse in a mikveh, and to wait for nightfall, and only then may they eat truma once again. And that is the zman of tzeis hakechavim. That is the point when we notice the light of at least 3 stars, medium-sized stars. That is the true point of nightfall. That is the time that Kehanim may eat their truma, and that is the time as well that we begin Krishma Shel Arvis. So that is the beginning of the Zman. Until when does the Zman Krishma extend? Continues the Mishnah, Ad Seifa Ashmura Harishayna, until the end of the first Ashmura, the first watch. We're referring to the groups of Malachim who rotate between themselves. They take turns regarding the Avodah in Shemayim, regarding saying Shira to Hashem, and throughout the night the groups of Malachim rotate, and the first group is up until 4 hours of the night. That is the Ashmur Harishayna. So up until then, says Rebbe Lezer, Divrei Rebbe Lezer, up until then is considered to be V'shachvacha. That is a time that generally ordinary people are still going to sleep. So according to Rebbe Lezer, the Zman begins from nightfall, tzeis hakechavim, extends up until the Seifa Ashmur Rishayna, which is 4 hours. One is required to say Krishma prior to Chatzos, up until midnight. He has up until daybreak, until the light of dawn rises. So according to Rabbi Gamliel, the interpretation, the meaning of a b'shachvacha is as long as people are still asleep, and that includes the entire night. There was a story where Rabbi Gamliel's children returned from a Beis HaMishta. According to the Teisis Yantiv, this is a wedding. We have not yet said Krishma, and it's already late, it's already past Chatos. What should we do? Apparently they were involved in being Mesameach, Chasam Rakala, and as we know, Ha'isik b'mitzvah, someone who is involved in a mitzvah, patam in a mitzvah, he's exempt from doing any other mitzvah. As the Mfarshim explained, one is meant to be totally immersed in the mitzvah at hand, and they came back home, they hadn't yet said Krishma. What should we do? Amar lahem. So the father told him, Im lo yolam shachar, if it is not yet daybreak chayav matem likrois, then you are certainly required to say Shema. Now even the Chachamim, who instructed us to be Kara Krishma prior to Chatzos, they really agree in theory that the interpretation of a shachvacha is the entire night, as long as people are asleep. However, the Chacham had a special reason for instructing one to be Kaira Krishma prior to Chatzos. That is only l'chatchila, it is only preferred. However, in your case, certainly you should be saying Krishma even now. Amru, not only in this case, in the case of Krishma, did the Chachamim instruct one to advance, to do it before Chatzos, although theoretically he may do so up until Aleis HaShachar. Whenever we find this limitation of Chatzos, in reality, the mitzvah really extends up until daybreak. For instance, Hektar Chalav Meivarim, the burning of the chalavim, of the fats, and the ivarim, the parts of the korban, the parts of the korban oila, it really extends up until Amud HaShachar. Now we know that primary avodas of a korban, Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, Zrika, they are limited to daytime. As we learn from a pasuk, B'yom Tzavoisai, they need to be done B'yom. However, regarding the leftovers, these avodas of Hektar, Chalav, Meivarim, there's an allowance for the entire night following the day of Akrava up until the next morning. Where else do we find another mitzvah which extends throughout the night? All the karbanos that are to be eaten, that are to be consumed, liyayim echad, for one day, meaning the day of the actual Hakrava and the night following that, one may really eat them until the next morning. If so, that the mitzvahs really extend the entire night, so why then do we find that the Chachamim instructed and limited only up until Chatzos, until midnight? The answer is in order to distance a person from an Avera, to ensure that a person doesn't transgress. So therefore the Chachamim imposed a limitation of Chatzos. In the case of Achilas Karbanos, since the Karban, if left past daybreak, it would be considered Noisar, and it involves an Isser, an Einish of Karis for one who eats it. Therefore the Chachamim were concerned, don't procrastinate, don't push it off, eat it only up until Chatzos and no more, in order to ensure that a person doesn't get even close to doing an Avera of Noisar. Similarly, in our case of Kriya Shema, Chachamim were concerned a person returns home late at night, tired from work, and perhaps he'll catch a nap, and sleep might overtake him completely, and he may lose out on the opportunity to fulfill this mitzvah of Kriya Shema. Therefore, the Chachamim instructed us to advance our Kriya Shema only up until Chatzos. Now, in the third case of the Hektar Chalav Meivarim, we don't find such a limitation, since that is referring to an avodah which transpired in the Beis Hamikdash and was conducted by the Kehanim. And as we know, Kehanim is Rizimheim, they are swift, they are conscientious, and therefore there is no concern in that case that they will transgress. So in conclusion, what is this man me'emasai koyer neshma ba'arovin? What is the time for Kriya Shema? It begins from Tzeisai Kechavim and extends up until, according to Rabbi Lezer, Atzeif Hashmur Rishona, according to Rabbi Gamliel, the entire night. According to the Chachamim, one is required, at least lechatchila, to do it only up until Chatzos. Ask Rashi Akasha, if so, that the Zman Kriya Shema only begins by Tzeisai Kechavim, then how do we daven Ma'ariv early? How do we daven Ma'ariv and say Kriya Shema while it is still day outside? Says Rashi, truthfully, the real Kiyum HaMitzvah, the fulfillment of Kiyum Mitzvah's Kriya Shema will only take place much later when one recites its Kriya Shema al Hamita, and that will be after nightfall. So why then do we say Kriya Shema prior to Shemona Esrei when we daven mi ba'odyom? It's still light outside, says Rashi, in the name of the Yerushalmi, Kedei lamoid betfila mitoich divrei Torah, in order to introduce our Shemona Esrei with the divrei Torah of Kriya Shema. It adds a positive element to our Shemona Esrei, and that is the reason for doing that, even though it is not the true Kiyum HaMitzvah of Kriya Shema at that point, since it's still day. Says Taisus, how could Rashi say that the true Kiyum HaMitzvah is only taking place al mitasoi, but at that point one only recites one parsha? He should be reciting all three parashas if that is indeed the true fulfillment of Kiyum Mitzvah's Kriya Shema. Another kasha Taisus asks, what about the brachos of Kriya Shema? We know that one is required to say brachos before and after Kriya Shema, as we will learn later on in the Masechta. By Kriya Shema Malamita, there is no brachos. Another kasha Taisus asks, what about a Talmud Chacham who is not required to say Kriya Shema Malamita, as the Gemara later says that the point of Kriya Shema Malamita is to protect one from mazikim, from evil forces, and a Talmud Chacham is already protected on account of his Torah. What about his mitzvahs Kiyum Kriya Shema? According to Rashi, he wasn't Yaitzi yet. So what's going to be with a Talmud Chacham who does not say Kriya Shema Malamita? So Taisus says it must be that the true Kiyum HaMitzvah, the true fulfillment of the obligation of Kriya Shema Shel Aretz really takes place during Ma'ariv, even though it's in Ba'odyom, it is still day. How is that so? The answer is because we're following Shitas Rabbi Yehuda. There's a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim regarding the Zman of Tfilas Mincha and the Zman of Tfilas Arvis. According to the Shitas Chachamim, which is the custom that we follow, Zman Tfilas Mincha extends up until nightfall. Afterwards begins the Zman Tfilas Arvis. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Tfilas Mincha is up until Plag HaMincha, up until an hour and a quarter prior to nightfall, and at that point Tfilas HaMincha ends, begins the Zman Tfilas Arvis. Says Tosfos, when we daven b'odyom, when we daven during the day prior to Tzeisai Kechavim, we are following the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Says Tosfos, but that cannot be so, because if we go ahead and daven Mincha past Plag HaMincha, we daven up until nightfall, in accordance to the Shitas Chachamim, then how can we turn around and daven Ma'ariv at that same moment and say, well, it's already nightfall, it's already a din of Laila? Because that is the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. This is a Tarta Desasri. This is a self-contradiction. So L'halacha, it's brought down, a practical halacha the Mishnah Berurah brings that preferably one should daven Ma'ariv and say Krishma only after Tzeitzei Kechavim. However, in a Shasat Chak, in a extraneous situation, one may daven Ma'ariv earlier, in accordance to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, even though the general custom is to follow Shitas Rabbanon. However, in a Shasat Chak, one may be Saimech on Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, rely on the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and daven Arvis from Plag HaMincha and on, even though it's still light outside. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, he should ensure not to make a tarti desasri. He shouldn't self-contradict himself. On that day that he plans on doing so, he should ensure that his mincha will be done before Plag HaMincha. He should daven mincha prior to Plag HaMincha, and then after Plag HaMincha, he may daven Ma'ariv. So he is following the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda in its entirety. However, a tarti desasri is not permitted, except in a situation of a tzibur, a community who will lose out on tefillah b'tzibur, since perhaps it's a situation where if the congregants disperse, they go back home, they might not come back from Ma'ariv later. So in that case, there's a special leniency that allows them, even if it's a tarti disaster, even if they've just daven mincha, to turn around and daven Ma'ariv miboidyaim. Now, what about a yachid who is present in that shul and he wants to have tefillah b'tzibur? If he waits around, he won't have tefillah b'tzibur. So the Mishnah Berurah says that he's allowed to daven Ma'ariv b'tzibur, even though it's m'ba'idyaim, provided again that he himself personally had daven mincha much earlier before Plag, so he's not exhibiting a tarti desasri. And in addition, the Mishnah Berurah says that he should daven Shemon Esrei with the tzibur. However, he should leave his Krishma and Brachos Krishma for later, after nightfall. And the son of the Chavetz Chaim, who was the author of the Mishnah Berurah, actually says that his father used to conduct himself in this manner. He should daven Shemon Esrei with the tzibur and complete his Shema and Brachos at a later time after nightfall. And a similar thing is brought down in Igros Moshe from Moshe Feinstein. So in conclusion, the preferred method is to daven Arvis after nightfall. In specific situations, leniencies are applied. There's one exception to this, which is Erev Shabbos. Since we have Makabel Shabbos early, or Makabel Kedusha Shabbos early, in that case it is the accepted custom to advance our Ma'ariv miboidyaim, to daven Ma'ariv early, but provided once again that we do not perform a tarti disasri, we must make sure to daven mincha before Plag, and then follow Ma'ariv after Plag in accordance to Shitas Rabbi Yehuda. Continues the Gemara. The Mishnah opened with a statement, Me'ei Masai, a question, Me'ei Masai, from when do we read Shema? What is the Zman? What is the time of Krishma? How do we even know that there is such a thing as Krishma? What is the Tana referring to? Says the Gemara, Tana hechi kai. What is the Tana referring to? Where is he referring to the Tani Me'ei Masai that he questions Me'ei Masai from when? What is the source of this mitzvah? Visu, in addition, another kasha. What about the order of the Tana? Maishna the Tani Arvis V'Reisha. Why does the Tana begin with a discussion regarding Krishma Shal Arvis, the nighttime Krishma? Listen to the Shachris V'Reisha. Perhaps the Tana should begin with a discussion of Krishma Shal Shachris. That is the beginning of the day. That is the beginning of the day cycle where a person begins serving Hashem from the morning till the night. Tesis adds that we find regarding the Karbanis Tamid, the Pasuk mentions the Tamid Shal Shachar and then the Tamid Shebein Arbaim. So we see that the order of events is first day, then comes the night. So we have two kashas. What is the source and why the order? Answers the Gemara, both kashas with one answer. Tana krokoi, the Tana is referring to the pasuk. The source of the mitzvah is the chsiv v'shach b'chol v'kamecha, when you lie down and when you arise. V'achik this is what the Tana says. Zman krishma de shchiva. What does the Torah mean that we akayr krishma b'shach v'cha? What is the time? What is the exact definition? Emas. When is that? Mishah shakahanim nechnos l'nach b'trumasim, from when the kehanim enter to eat their truma, which is tzeisek kechavim. So in effect, we answered both questions with one answer. Since the Tana is coming to explain the pasuk of b'shach v'cha v'kamecha, and in the pasuk, how does the pasuk state the order? First, b'shach v'cha, which is krishma shal arvis, and then only shal shachris. Therefore, the Tana follows in that same order. V'bayisema, another teretz, to answer the second kasha, the question of the order of events. Yolif m'briyasa shalaylam. The Tana derives the day cycle, the order of events, from the same order that we find b'briyasa shalaylam, by the creation of the world. Erev, first night, vayivayik, and then morning, yom echad, one day. So we see that is the proper order of the cycle. First the night, and then the day. If so, that you are deriving from briyasa shalaylam, and the proper way is to discuss first night and then day, Sefer Diktani, in the Sefer, in the latter part of the Mishnah, it says, by Krishma in the morning, we make two blessings, two brachos prior to Krishma, and one bracha afterwards. Before Krishma we say Yitzir Oyer and Avasayim, Avarava. After Krishma comes Emes V'Yatziv. Ube'erev, regarding Krishma Shalaris, he makes two brachas before, and two following. So in the second Mishnah, in the Sefer, why there does the Tana switch things around? Why doesn't he go along with the same type of sequence of first discussing Krishma Shal Arvis and then Krishma Shal Shachris? Listen to Arvis Bereisha. He should precede Arvis before Shachris. Answers the Gemara, Tana, Pasach B'Arvis. He opens up with Arvis. V'hadar Tani B'Shachris, then proceeds to Shachris, because that is the proper order of events. But then, for clarity purpose, Adekoy B'Shachris, once, since he is still involved in discussing the halachas of Shachris, of Krishna Shel Shachris, Parish Mili de Shachris. Therefore he proceeds to explain halachas relating Krishna Shel Shachris until he completes that. V'hada Parish Mili de Arvis. Then he returns back to Krishna Shel Arvis to complete instructing us the halachas relating to Krishna Shel Arvis. So for clarity's sake, the Tana did it in this way. He began with Arvis, continued on to Shachris, completed Shachris in its entirety, and then went back to finish up the halachas of Arvis. Continues the Gemara. Amar Mar. We've learned in the Mishnah, what is the Zman Krishma Mishah, from the time Shakahanim Nichnasim Lechol B'Trumasam, from when the Kehanim come to eat their Trumah. Says the Gemara, why in such a roundabout description? Why did the Tana choose to describe, to instruct the Zman Krishma Shal Arvis in such a cryptic way to the Kehanim coming to eat their Trumah? Why not simply state from Tzeisa Kechavim? Says the Gemara, Michli, let's see. Kehanim emas ka'achli Trumah. When do Kehanim begin to eat their Trumah? Mishas Tzeisa Kechavim. From Tzeisa Kechavim. From when you notice the stars and it is nightfall. If so, listen to Mishas Tzeisa Kechavim. Why does the Mishnah simply state that the Zman Krishma is from Tzeisa Kechavim? Why get the Kehanim involved? What is the Mishnah trying to teach us? Says the Gemara, Milsa agav urche kamash malan. Surely the primary lesson in this Mishnah is regarding Krishma Shal Arvis. However, the Tana is teaching us something agav urche, by the way, that Kehanim emas ka'achli betruma, when may a Kohen begin eating Truma, mishas Tzeisa Kechavim, from Tzeisa Kechavim, and this is a very powerful lesson. Why? Well, kamash malan, the Tana is teaching us the chapar loy me'akva. Although we're speaking about perhaps a kohen who needs to bring a kapara on the next day, he's a zav, etc., certain types of tumah which require 3 stages to completely cleanse the kohen. One is tvila, second hair of shemesh, a third is a karban. Although he's still required to bring a karban, that is loy ma'akva. Atonement is not ma'akva, it will not prevent him, it will not hold him back from eating truma. As soon as he was toivel and has hair of shemesh, it is already the end of the day, Tzeisa Kechavim, he's entitled to eat his Trumah Kedesanya, like we find in the Brisa, which teaches us the same halacha, Uba Hashemesh v'toher, the sun will set and will be cleansed. Bias Shimshay Ma'akvasai, the setting of the sun holds him back, Melechol B'Trumah, from eating Trumah. He needs to wait until sunset. V'ein Kaparasai Ma'akvasai Melechol B'Trumah. However, bringing a karban, that does not prevent him from eating Trumah. Says, how do you know to interpret the pasuk this way? Uba Hashemesh v'toher is referring to sunset and nightfall. Umibai dahayu Uba Hashemesh bias shemesh. How do you know that Uba Hashemesh, the coming of the sun, is referring to the sun setting? V'hai v'toher, and the next word v'toher is referring to toher yoma, how the day was cleansed, meaning A, the sun set, B, the light of the day was totally cleansed and removed. It is completely night. And that already allows the kohen to eat his truma. Dilma, perhaps we can interpret the pasuk differently. perhaps he needs to wait until the next day that he brings his karbanos. And we will interpret the pasuk accordingly. Dilma bias ayrayu. Uba shemesh means not that the sun disappears, but rather that the sun arrives on the following day, after tefillah, after Herav Shemesh. Bias ayrayu. Uma v'toyer. What is the pasuk continuing? Ba shemesh v'toyer. Toyer gavra. The gavra, the man, needs to bring his karbanos. He's obligated to bring his karbanos to become fully tar and to allow him to eat truma. So how do you know to interpret the pasuk one way? Perhaps we can interpret it differently. Amar Rabba bar Shila, im kain, if that is the pshat in the pasuk, that Uba Shemesh means the coming of the sun, the rising of the sun on the following day, and V'tar is the instructions, is the commandment, is the tzivui, you must bring your karbanos. Leimakra, in this case, in our case where there's some room for confusion, we can interpret it one way, we can interpret it differently. So if so, the Torah should be a little bit more explicit and clear. Leimakra v'yitar. The Torah should say v'yitar, he must bring his karbanos. My v'tar. Why does the Torah use this passive term v'tar? It will be cleansed. It sounds like it's a more of an automatic result of Ba'ashemesh. It must be v'tar yoyma that is speaking about the cleansing of the day, meaning when the sun sets, then v'tar, it automatically what follows is a cleansing of the day, a removal of all light, and surely this is referring to Herav Shemesh, the night before the Havaras Karbanis. So in conclusion, Ba Shemesh V'tar means sunset and Tzeisak Echavim and no more. Kedamar in Shirak we find a similar phrase used by people, Arev Shimsha V'yitki Yaima, the sun has set, has darkened, and the day has cleansed. B'Ma'arava, in the west, in Eretz Yisrael, Hadu Rabba bar Shila lo shmi'alu. They did not hear this interpretation, this proof of Rabba bar Shila, uboilu mibayi. And they had the same type of question. When does a kohen, when does his entitlement begin? Is it from Herav Shemesh, or does he need to wait until his karbanis? Uboilu mibayi, they had a question. Hayu Uba Shemesh. But the pasuk says Uba Shemesh. Biya Shimshayu? Is it the sun setting? Umay v'tar ter yoma. V'tar means the day was cleansed, it was nightfall. Oidilma bias oirehu. Ba Shemesh means the sun will arrive, will rise. And the next day, umay v'tar ter gavra. And v'tar means that the person needs to bring his karbanis. V'hadar pashtulam ibraisa. Then they went ahead and they clarified it from a braisa. Midiktanin b'braisa. The braisa referring to Tzeisak Echavim says, similar davar. What is a simon for the Zman Krishma? It is the Zman that the Kehanim may eat a Trumah. And what is the sign? Tzeisak Echavim. So we see that the entitlement of the Kehanim regarding Trumah is synonymous with Tzeisak Echavim. Shema mina bias shimshehu umay v'toyer ter yema. Evidently, when the Torah says Uba Shemesh v'toyer regarding a kohen's entitlement to eat Trumah, the Torah means Uba Shemesh that the sun sets, v'toyer ter yema that the day was cleansed, meaning it became completely night. So they brought a raya from the Brisa, which was referring to the Zman Krishma Shel Arvis, and the Brisa says the Zman Krishma begins when the Kahanim eat their Truma. What is a sign? How do you know when that's taking place? It says the Brisa, the sign is Tzeisak Echavim, so evidently that is already the Zman, the time that a Kohen may eat Truma. Continues the Gemara. Amar Mar. Misha shakahanim nechnosim lecha b'trumasim. That is the Zman of Krishma. V'raminu, we find a Brisa which states otherwise, which gives us a different time for Krishma. Says the Brisa, Me'ema saikar neshma ba'arvin. Me'ema saikar neshma ba'aravin. From when does one recite Shema in the evening? Says the Brisa, Misha oni nichnas lechol pita b'melach. When a poor man comes home to eat his meager meal of bread with salt, he doesn't require much preparation. And this is a relatively early time. Ad, up until when may one read Krishma? Until when the poor man prepares himself to finish, to get up from his meal. So it's a very short time slot. Certainly the latter part of the Brisa, which gives us a very short deadline for Krishma, is certainly disputing the Seif Zman mentioned in our Mishnah. So in conclusion, we have 4 Seif Zmanim. We have the time when the ani gets up from his meal, which is a very brief period. We have the extended period of Asayf HaShmur Rishon according to Rabbi Lezer. We have the period of Chatzos. We have Ad Alis HaShacha of Ram Gamliel. This is regarding the deadline until when does the Zman Krishma extend to. However, regarding the Tchila Zman Krishma, let's explore further. Sakti Gemara again, Seifa Vada Pliga Masnissen. The last part of the Brisa, discussing the end, the deadline of Krishma, which is when the Ani gets up, certainly that is at odds, that is disputing the Shir in the Mishnah, which states otherwise. However, the Reisha, the first part of the Brisa, which gives us the Tchilas Manu, from when does one recite Krishma, from when the Ani comes to eat his meal, Milema Pligia Masnissen, perhaps, could we suggest that perhaps it is not really a machlekes? The Zman of Ani perhaps is synonymous with the Zman of Kayin. They're both says the Gemara, indeed, loy Ani, loy, no, there's no machlekes, Ani ve'Kayin chashirhu. The description of the Zman of an Ani coming to eat is the exact same time period where Kayin goes to eat his Trumah, which is both Tzeis HaKechavim. So there's no machlekes between the Mishnah and the Brisa, since Ani and Kayin are the exact same moment. Says the Gemara, can you suggest that an Ani and Kayin are referring to the same exact moment? We have a Brisa which seems to indicate otherwise. Says Brisa number 2, V'raminu me'ema saimas chilin likrois Krishma ba'arvis. From when does one recite Krishma? Me'shah shabnei Adam, ordinary people, nichnasan lechol piton ba'arvis shabbos. From the time that ordinary people come home to eat their Suda, their meal, on Erev Shabbos. It is relatively earlier than a weekday meal since everything was already prepared. So that is the Zman Haschalas Krishma Shal Arvis. Divir Rav Meir, V'chachamim oimrim, Mishah shakehanim zakoin lechol b'trumasan. From when the Kehanim are entitled to eat their Truma, which is similar davar. What is a sign for that moment? This is the Brisa we mentioned earlier, similar davar, Tzeis HaKechavim, that is Tzeis HaKechavim. So, in conclusion, we have so far two Brisas. One Brisa tells us that the Zman Krishma begins from when an Ani goes to eat his meal and extends up until when he finishes his meal. So the Zman Tchilas Krishma is Ani. Depends on the time, the Zman Achila of an Ani. We've concluded before that the Zman of Ani coincides, is synonymous with the Zman of Kayin. They're both referring to the same exact point in time, Tzeis HaKechavim. Now we have another Brisa, where Rav Meir teaches us that the Zman Krishma is entirely different. It begins from when ordinary people go to eat their meal on Erev Shabbos. Now, it would seem to be that since the reason why people eat early on Erev Shabbos is because it doesn't require much preparation. That would seem to be the same exact time of an Ani, since he doesn't either require preparation during the week. So it seems like both Zmanim, the Zman of Ani and the Zman where Bnei Adam eat their Suda of Erev Shabbos, would seem to be the same point in time. We'll discuss that a bit further in the Gemara. Continues the Brisa regarding Shitas Chachamim. Chachamim said that the Zman is Kehanim going to eat their Truma, which is Tzeis HaKechavim. Now, how do we know? Where do we find a support to this? Where do we find a source that nighttime begins at Tzeis HaKechavim? Say the Chacham, Ad Aval Pi She'ein Ra'ai L'Davar. Even though there's no proof, we don't have a absolute proof for this principle. Zeich L'Davar. Certainly, we have an indication. Why? Because we'll bring a proof, a pasuk from the Binyan Beis Hamikdash describing when the Yidden were involved in constructing the Beis Hamikdash, and it says there that they were involved in their malacha and their construction the entire day, from Alois HaShachar, from the light of dawn until Tzeis HaKechavim, until nighttime. We seem to have an indication from there that a day consists of from Alois HaShachar to Tzeis HaKechavim. So that is somewhat of an indication regarding Krishma as well. However, it isn't an absolute proof, since perhaps the definition of Yom and Laila regarding the construction of Beis Hamikdash is not necessarily the same definition and doesn't follow the same parameters as Krishma. but nevertheless it is somewhat of an indication. It's not a proof, it is certainly an indication that nighttime begins at the point of Tzeis HaKechavim, and therefore the Zman Krishma, which is a B'Shachvacha, is connected to nighttime, will begin at that point as well, the Shas Tzeis HaKechavim. Shenemar, V'anachnu oisim b'malacha, we're involved in constructing the Beis HaMikdash, v'chetzio machzikim b'ramachim, and half of them are holding the spears, me'aleis hashachar, from the light of dawn at Tzeis HaKechavim. V'oimer, another pasuk says, V'hoyelonu halayla mishmar, the night was was designated for watching, V'yoyim malacha, and the day was designated for work. Why do we need another pasuk to prove the same thing? Perhaps from the first pasuk it wouldn't be much of an indication. Although the pasuk says that they were involved in malacha from Aleis HaShachar up until Tzeis HaKechavim, perhaps in reality the day ends at Shkias HaChama, at sunset, not at complete nightfall. But the people involved in the construction of the Beis HaMikdash, because of their enthusiasm, they stayed late, they stayed extra, they stayed overtime, past the beginning of the night. So perhaps the fact that they stayed and worked until Tzeis HaKechavim is not a true indication for the definition of a Laila. Perhaps the Laila will begin way back by Shkias HaChama, during sunset, but they stayed extra time. Says the Gemara, V'chitema, perhaps I can suggest, V'chi'ar v'shim shav Laila, when the sun set, that already constitutes Laila. Lailahu, v'hinu, but they, the machashchim ekadmi, they stayed late, they came early, so perhaps we can't have an indication from there that Tzeis HaKechavim is the beginning of night. Tashma, come on here, the second pasuk. That's why we require another pasuk to support this raya. V'hayalonu halayla mishma v'yam malacha, because they defined the point in time of construction, the time that they were busy working was considered Yom. The time that they were working was defined as being Yom. So if we see that their work stretched from Aleis HaShachar up until Tzeis HaKechavim, inevitably that constitutes Yom, and from there on is Laila. So we have an indication that the definition of Yom is from Aleis HaShachar until Tzeis HaKechavim, and Laila begins from Tzeis HaKechavim, and therefore that is the proper time for Krishma Shel Aris from the Kehanim's entitlement of Trumah, which is Tzeis HaKechavim, which is the Shitas Chachamim. Continues the Gemara. Kasanka daitach. We perhaps can ponder and suggest the ani ubnei adam chat, that the zman of ani, when the ani comes to eat his meal during the week, ubnei adam, and the time mentioned by Reb Meir, where the general public comes to eat their Suda, B'Arish Shabbos is Friday night, since both times have one underlying reason, they're based on one principle that there's no preparation required for both meals, so perhaps they are both the same exact point in time, Chachiru. So perhaps they both coincide and represent the same moment. Now, Vi Amris, let's go back. Initially we had a stira, we brought the first brisa, which seems to be stating a shir other than the shir stated in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah stated a shir of Kehanim, of Tzeis HaKechavim, being the Tchilas Man Krishma. The brisa number 1 brought a different shir of Ani. So the Gemara said that perhaps it's not a machlekes because Ani is the same shir as Kayin. So now let's take it a step further. If Ani is the same as Kayin, and if Ani is the same as Bnei Adam, the time that people go eat their meal Friday night, Shitas Rameir. So if all three things are the same exact identical point in time, Ani, Kayin, and Bnei Adam, so we have no machlekes between Rameir and Rabbanan. The Rabbanan who state Kayin, which is Ani, and Rameir who says Bnei Adam, which is also Ani, they're all speaking about the same point in time. And the Brisa clearly presents these Shitas as opposing views. Says the Gemara inside. If you say Ani Bnei Adam is one shir, as well as one share. If so, everybody's saying the same thing. You must say, you must conclude, you must say that Ani and Kayin are two separate shiurim. Meaning that the Bnei Adam, the share of Bnei Adam, V'Rameir, that indeed is the same as Ani. Because as we mentioned, they're both based on the same concept of non-preparation. Both meals don't require preparation, and therefore they're both taking place at the same time. The ani has a meager meal and doesn't prepare much. The Bnei Adam have their meal prepared before Shabbos, and therefore both of these zmanim, ani Bnei Adam, coincide. They're both the same exact point in time. So Reb Meir's zman of Bnei Adam is actually the same as ani, which is mentioned in Brisa number 1. However, ani is not the same as koyin, meaning the zman of koyin mentioned in our Mishnah is not the same as the zman ani, which is mentioned in Brisa number 1, and subsequently, the zman of koyin that the Chachamim mentioned in Brisa number 2 is also not the same as ani mentioned in Brisa number 1. So the result will be that there is a machlekes between our Mishnah, which states the zman of koyin, and Brisa number 1, which stated a shir of ani. And we're trying to avoid that. It says the Gemara, loy. Let's not say that. Ani v'koyin chad shiru. Let's go back to our first assertion that ani is the same shir as koyin. If so, everybody's saying the same thing, and there's no machlekes between Rameh and the Chacham. How could that be? V'ani b'nei Adam lav chad shiru. Your second assumption that you made, that ani and b'nei Adam, meaning the shita of Reb Meir regarding b'nei Adam eating their suda on Erev Shabbos, you assume that that is the same as ani. That is not so. Ani and b'nei Adam are two separate shiurim. So in conclusion, we have two brises. Brisa number 1 and Brisa number 2. In Brisa number 1, there was a shir of ani. A shir of ani, according to the conclusion of the Gemara, is the same as shir of koyin. Therefore, there's no machlekes, there's no dispute between the Brisa and our Mishnah, which gives us a shir of ani. This is the same zman as shitas Rabbanan in Brisa number 2, shitas zman of kehanim. So koyin and ani are synonymous, and this is in dispute of shitas Reb Meir, who holds that the zman is bnei Adam. It depends on when people eat their suda on Erev Shabbos, which indeed is a separate time. So of all three descriptions, ani, koyin, and bnei Adam is the odd one out. It says the Gemara, ani v'koyin chashiru. How can you suggest once again that an ani is the same as a koyin? We have a brisa that seems to indicate otherwise. They cannot be the same thing. V'raminu, we've learned in a brisa. This brisa will list for us 5 shitas of the tchilas zman krishma. When is the beginning of the zman krishma ba'aravin mishah shakidesh hayom ba'avish shabbos? From when the day becomes sanctified, become kaddish on Erev Shabbos, which is bein hashmashos, which is the point of twilight between day and night, when there is an uncertainty, there's a suffix as to the legal status of that moment, and therefore we must be stringent and advance our Shabbos prior to that point, to bein hashmashos. So that is already constitutes somewhat b'shachvacha. It is already related to nighttime and is considered the zman krishma. Divrei Rebbe Lezer. Rabbi Shua Eimer mishasha kahanim mituharim lechol b'trumasam. From when kohanim are already tahir and are entitled to eat that truma, which is tzeisek kechavim. Rabbi Meir Eimer mishasha kahanim toivim lechol b'trumasam. From when the kohanim go to be toivel, which is prior to nightfall, since they need to do it in this order, they need to be toivel and then have Herav Shemesh. So this takes place prior to Bein Hashmashos, and that is the beginning of the Zman Krishma Shel Arvis. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, how can you suggest that the Zman Krishma Shel Arvis begins when they go to the mikveh? That is way too early. It is still daylight. They are toivel when it's still light outside. How can you suggest that that is the description of a shachvacha? When you lie down, it's still day outside. So we'll see soon Rabbi Meir's response to Rabbi Yehuda. Continues the brisa, another shita. Rabbi Chanina Omer, what is the zman krishma mishasha ani nichnas lechol pitay v'melach? When the ani comes home to eat his meager meal of bread and salt, and that is the shita of ani which we mentioned before. Rabbi Achai v'Amrilo, some say it's Rabbi Achai Omer mishah sheroiv bnei adam nichnasim lahasev. At the point in time when most people and ordinary people recline to eat their weekday meal. So in conclusion, we have 5 shitas mentioned in this brisa. Number 1, the easy one, is kaihanim, which is tzeisek kechavim, the same as mentioned in our Mishnah. Then we have another 4 zmanim, 2 prior prior to Tzeitzei Kechavim. One is Mishekidish Hayom Ba'arish Shabbosais, when we need to start keeping Shabbos. Number two is, following that is when the Kehanim are Toivel, according to the Meiri. It goes in that order. They are Toivel after the Zman of Kiddush Hayom Ba'arish Shabbosais. So these two Shiurim take place prior to Tzeitzei Kechavim. Then we have an additional two Shitos describing two other Shiurim. One is the Zman of Ani coming on to eat, and one is the Zman of ordinary people coming on to eat during the weekdays. Says the Gemara, if so, how can you suggest that Ani is the same as Kohen? In this Brisa, we have two Shitas. One holds Ani, one holds Kohen. Obviously, it's two separate Zmanim. V'amers Ani v'Kohen chashiru. If Ani and Kohen are describing the same exact moment, Rabbi Chanina, the Shita of Rabbi Chanina who says Ani, I know Rabbi Shua, that's exactly the Shita of Rabbi Shua who says Kehanim. Now we're forced to conclude that indeed Shiura, the Ani Lachud, the Shir of Ani is separate, V'Shir the Kohen Lachud, and the Shir of Kohen is separate, Shema Minah. That is the conclusion. So, in summary, what is the Zman Krishma Shel Arvis? So the Zman Krishma, we have a choice of four Shitas. The first one would be the Brisa and the Gemara, that it's a very short time. It's up until the Ani gets up from his meal. The Mishnah had three more Shitas, according to Rabbi Lezer, up until the Seifa Shmur Rishona, fourth until the end of the fourth hour, according to Chachamim at Chatzos, according to Rav Gamliel, the whole night. Ad Alis HaShachar. What about the Tchilas Zman Kriya Shema Shel Arvis? We have five Shitas. One is Tzeitzei Kechavim, the Kehanim. We have two Shitas that describe Shiurim prior to Tzeitzei Kechavim. One is when Shabbos becomes Kaddish. One is when Kehanim go to be Toivel. Then we have another two Shitas post Tzeitzei Kechavim. One is when an Ani goes to eat, and one is when the Bnei Adam, ordinary people, go to have their meal during the weekdays. And the conclusion is, regarding Ani and Kohen, that certainly they are describing two separate Zmanim and are not related to each other, and the result would be that the Brisa, which gives a share of Ani, Brisa number one, is indeed Chelik, disputing our Mishnah, which gives a share of Kohen. Continues the Gemara. Amar Ma, we just learned, Amar Le, Haymanai Miuchar. Which one is later? Which one, the Ani or the Kohen? Which comes first? Mistaver, says the Gemara, the Ani Miuchar. Ani comes after Kohen. The Amers Ani Muktam. If you'll say that Ani comes before Kohen, before Tzeitzei Kechavim, Rabbi Chanina, Hani Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Chanina, who gives us the time of Ani, he will be synonymous with Shitz Rabbi Lezer, who gives us a shir of Kiddush Hayom, which is also prior to Tzeitzei Kechavim. As the Taisus explains, it is not logical that there are so many different time discrepancies, so many different classifications of time of Zman Shchiva taking place in such a short amount of time of pre-Tzeitzei Kechavim. Therefore, inevitably, you have to say that the Zman of Ani is happening after Tzeitzei Kechavim, Alash Shema Minah. You must conclude the Ani Mu'uchar. Ani is after Tzeitzei Kechavim, after Kohen, Shema Minah. That's the conclusion. Amar Mar, we've just learned. Amar Le Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda responded to Rav Meir. You've stated that the Zman Krishma of V'shachvacha is the time when Kehanim go be Toivel. Well, the Kehanim are Toivel by Jayim, but it's still day. How can you suggest that that is the interpretation of V'shachvacha when you lie down, which is indicative of nighttime? It seems that Rav Yehuda had a valid argument. Rav Meir responds to Rav Yehuda as follows. Me Saras, do you hold that I'm following your opinion regarding the definition of ben hashmashos? There's a machlekes. What is exactly ben hashmashos? According to Rabbi Yehuda, ben hashmashos encompasses a very large time period prior to Tzeitzei Kechavim. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, when a kohen is toivel prior to ben hashmashos, surely it is a very, very large amount of time prior to Tzeitzei Kechavim. It is still broad daylight. However, says Rav Meir, I'm following the shita, the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, who gives ben hashmashos a very short time period. I'm following the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the Amar Rabbi Yossi ben hashmashos keref ayin. It is so short, it's like the blink of an eye. One comes in, one comes out. The night comes in and the day goes out. The F Shalom Aleilav is a fraction of a second. It cannot be determined. One cannot determine the exact moment of Ben Hashmashos. Therefore, since Ben Hashmashos encompasses just a very small, minute time period, certainly when a kohen is toiled prior to Ben Hashmashos, it is already getting dark, and it can be considered to be Uveshachbacha. Now, there's a discussion amongst the Farshim. What is the definition of Ben Hashmashos? It is uncertainty. We're not sure if it's day or night. Is it because we're not sure whether it's day or night, or because it combines both elements of day and night, and therefore it is, in essence, a suffix and uncertainty that cannot be determined? We'll leave that up to you to figure out. Says the Gemara, Kashi de Rameya de Rameya. We've had two Rameyers. One Rameyer in Brisa number 2 that gave a zman of when people come to eat their Suda B'Arish Shabbosis, and a Brisa number 3, we had another Rameyer. When the Kehanim go be Toivel, it seems to be a contradiction in Rameyer himself. Says the Gemara, Trei Tanai, these are two Tanaim who authored their Brises, Alib the Rameya, according to Rameya, each one had their own version of Rameyer's Shita. Says the Gemara, the same Kasha we've got in Rabbi Lezer. Kasha, Rabbi Lezer. We have two Rabbi Lezers. One Rabbi Lezer back in the Mishnah, who said that the Krishma begins from Tzesek Echavim up until Ashmur Rishayna. And we have Rabbi Lezer in the Brisa number 3, which states the Zman Krishma beginning from Kiddush Hayoim Ba'arish Habasais. A contradiction. Says the Gemara, the same thing. Trei Tanoi, Alib the Rabbi Lezer. These are two Tanoim who authored their Brisers according to their version of Rabbi Lezer. One was the Tan of the Mishnah, and one was the Tan of the Brisa number 3. Vibai same another thirds. Reisha Lav Rabbi Lezer. But we have in the Yahu Mishnah that Rabbi Lezer is quoted as saying that Krishma begins from Tzeis HaKechavim until Ashmur Rishayna. In reality, Rabbi Lezer's part in that is only the last part of the statement. The end, the deadline. Rabbi Lezer says the end line, the deadline of Zman Krishma is Ashmur Rishayna. However, the first part of the Mishnah, which states that the beginning of Zman Krishma is from Tzesek Chavim, that is not Shittas Rabbi Lezer, because Rabbi Lezer on his own holds that the Krishma begins from Kiddush Hayayim Ba'arish Habbasis. So in conclusion, we have two versions of Rabbi Meir and two versions of Rabbi Lezer. In Rabbi Meir, we have a machlekes whether he holds the Zman Krishma begins from the Suda of Arish Habbasis, or whether it begins from a Kahanim Toivlim. And in Rabbi Lezer, we have a machlekes whether, according to the first teretz of the Gemara, whether it begins from Tzesek Echavim or Misha Shekiddush Hayayim Ba'arei Shabbosos.